This is Adherence to Regulations. Thank you for watching. I am Kevin England. When it comes to keeping yourself in good standing, there are some common sense things you have to do. In this lesson, we'll use New Jersey to illustrate how to navigate finding regulations that apply to beekeeping. Considerations for working harmoniously with what is in your regional space. Cottage laws provide another area of focus, and specifics to New Jersey to consider that might also be in play if you're outside of the state. In the end, we'll provide links to statutes as well as a web page for the U.S. and its territories. When starting the conversation with you, it helps to draw a comparison. Given we're aware that the beekeepers coming into this course are coming from US and Canada. Our New Jersey laws and regulations are, of course, unique to the state, but in principle, we could use them to learn, and it serves well to illustrate a model that makes sure you have a good plan. We'll start with the simple concept. Legislators, apiarists, neighbors, in general, people like beekeepers. They don't have a bone to pick with you, as what we do is seen as an admirable pursuit. However, laws are laws and regulations are regulations, and if you're not following them, you are not defensible, no matter how someone may be sympathetic to your case. There is a malady of bees called American foul brood. It is thankfully not very common, but it has not been eradicated and it's highly contagious. It is extremely damaging to colonies, and most colonies have to be destroyed if they have a case of it. This might be an overreach to say that American foul brood is why we have laws for movable comb, but it's probably also not a stretch. The principle is, if you need to determine if a colony has American foul brood, then you need to be able to inspect the honeycomb and see the bees. Illustratively, if you were using an old-fashioned skep basket to host your hives, they inherently do not feature honeycomb that can be inspected, and that would make you non-compliant. This example, movable comb, I'll go out on a limb and say that it's a regulation in all 50 states of the U.S. and will be in the laws of every state in the nation. The good news for you is that Langstroth hives comply by proxy. It should be evident to say that if you have too many hives on a single location, it will eventually lead to problems. New Jersey, by example, has come up with a regulation that dictates the density of hives permissible on a property, as you see on the slide. Now, some states have rules for this and others do not. We are assuming that you're following the program guide and starting with 2 hives. This is pretty much suitable for most typical properties, but we would still suggest that smaller properties warrant a case-by-case common sense review, even if you're within the guidelines. Now, I personally used to own a property that was a half acre, but the footprint of the property was narrow across and deep. The shape of the property also meant that it had odd connections with 5 adjoining properties. There was physically no logical way to adhere to the proper setbacks, even though technically the property was suitable for 6 hives if you follow the guidance on the slide. So simply put, it just wouldn't have worked. Consider your situation and make sure you do the right thing. We've mentioned this as a consideration in the previous lesson. It's not that much of a consideration from a legal standpoint, but there's kind of an unwritten law, a code, if you subscribe to the Beekeeper Code, that if someone has bees in your vicinity, you don't force the situation in the area. Now, this is a bit of a gray area, but if, for example, someone has a commercial apiary right near your property and you're bringing in bees, it may or may not cause issues to consider. If anything, the beekeeper with more hives wins in most conflicts when it comes to the impacts of how the bees interact. Now, we don't mean confrontations, we mean that a large count of hives could come to your property, rob out your colonies, and that's not going to work. It's only the right thing for you to learn, if a commercial establishment is near you, that you don't do any harm for both your sakes. Even if you own the land and have a right, and yes, we feel for you, and that's kind of a bummer, but you have to consider the situation and again, do the right thing. Setbacks, when stipulated, are not optional. Inspectors, municipal officials, and others, they'll get a tape measure out and measure from the property line, and they have every right to do so. New Jersey has some fairly clear clauses on this, and you are obligated to follow these in the same way you are obligated to follow the traffic laws in your state. It's kind of disconcerting to listen to some beekeepers declare some form of rights based on rationalizations when it comes to whether they need to adhere or not. As we see it, law is the law. End of story. As the last clause says, err on the side of caution. While you technically might be okay at 10.1 feet from the property line, you're really better off to move it as far as practical to keep yourself defensible. Don't test the boundaries, so to speak. It's just not worth the hit. New Jersey recently implemented a stipulation that beekeepers have a requirement upon inspection to provide proof of a beginner's certificate as stated on the slide. This, of course, can differ from state to state and even down to town, municipal, city, and state levels. As it is with the laws, it's incumbent upon you to know what you are beholden to. There are often supporting details as to what qualifies, exemptions, instructions, and other information about these things, like what's shown on the slide about training exemptions and such. The best course of action is to do your research, get informed, and build a plan to conform. Besides setbacks, density stipulations, training, and other common regulatory considerations, one that is quite universal is hive registration. The details on the slide demonstrate some of the instructions for how New Jersey handles mandatory apiary registrations. Be aware that some of these programs, the cost to operate is borne by the beekeeper, meaning you have to pay a registration fee, and that is on a case-by-case basis depending on how your programs are managed. As a new beekeeper, cottage laws probably don't parlay that much into what you're doing, but it's important to know that they're out there. If at some point, as a beekeeper, you decide you want to sell goods, it may or may not come under influence of a state's cottage law. In New Jersey, this is not the case for raw honey. They recently exempted that. But if you're doing anything like mixing products into food, say cinnamon into creamed honey or something like that, then you are subject to the laws and need to follow the directions on the slide. Do look up your cottage laws and become familiar with them, especially if you're going to go into any products of the hive. I don't think I've heard of any state that does not provide themselves with the right to come onto your property unannounced and check your apiary. As we said with American foul brood, if they find hives in your area with foul brood, they're going to want to be able to come in and inspect your hives to see whether you're impacted or not. Now, I haven't gone state to state and looked at the legislation to see if they have that clause in every state, but my guess is that it's probably universal. Now, most states provide the state apiarist or whoever's in charge with enforcing the duties the right to inspect and also the right to check for adherence to laws. So they do have the right to ask you if you have your training in line. They want to make sure you have your hives marked as stipulated or whatever your state requires of you. Now, most of the time when we see the state apiarists, it's an invited visit, friendly visit, or they're there to help you with whatever you have going on. They're not out to be police in that way. But do know that if you see a state apiarist on your property, make sure you have your things in order and get them what they need so they can get on their way. Do check your state laws for exactly how this works in your location. So expanding on this a little bit further, there are other stipulations that are plausible for states, and in New Jersey there's a couple more. Minimum management practices. You must demonstrate that you have an adequate water source on the property for the bees. You have to manage your bees. You can't just set them out and leave them. They don't want abandoned hives all over the state. And one of the things that they have to be managed for is swarm prevention. The slide here tells you that wherever you are, New Jersey or afar, you really need to do your homework to know how to adhere to the obligations of the laws and be a good beekeeper. Coming back to American foul brood, even though it's very uncommon and noted earlier extremely detrimental, you have an implied obligation to call as soon as possible to inform of any outbreak that you discover. You should also know that transport of bees is also regulated. We're not going to elaborate on that, but there are often stipulations for transporting bees, especially across state lines, and you need to know them if you happen to find yourself moving your bees. Dovetailing on that, we don't anticipate you'll be selling bees, but as someone who is going to be purchasing bees, you should know that your seller is subject to the laws of the state. As we said in the previous lesson, we would hope that you would spend some time discussing it with your bee supply company, the details of where your bees are coming from, and that if you wanted to, you can ask them to produce a certificate that was issued to them by their state agency if it applies. This is typically commonplace from state to state to have a certificate to move bees in order to control the spread of disease across the region. I would hope that we're doing a reasonable job to tell you it's really incumbent upon you to know the guidelines, the laws, the regulations to become a compliant beekeeper. Now, becoming a good beekeeper doesn't end at your getting started activities. It's really something you should be proactive to follow the laws and legislations that apply to you and know what's going on. As to when you have questions, there's some good ways to go, which is to seek out your state and local officials in beekeeping, meaning the association, your apiarist, your Department of Agriculture, your extension centers. We're not thinking that it's a great path to go to your local municipal officials. Generally, they're not up on beekeeping laws, and you'd probably be better off staying with people that are in the beekeeping arena. Now, one thing to note about state apiarists is their job is thankless. They have a massive task amongst themselves, and they tend to make themselves available at local beekeeping meetings and other events throughout the year, and that's a great place to go and hear what they have to say and encounter them to ask some questions if you have a couple things that are on your mind. You could always drop them a phone call or send them an email too. They're usually pretty responsive to get back to beekeepers as their constituents. One exception, of course, is if you have American foul brood. That one requires an immediate phone call to the state apiarist. They typically will stop everything that they're doing to come out and see you. If you're from New Jersey, these are the links to the resources you need to know backward and forward. But if you're not from New Jersey, typically you can find what you're looking for by asking at your state association, looking at your state's extension office, agricultural office, or whoever oversees beekeeping for your area. Know that they're going to have these funny codes and titles and so on, and you need to do your research to find whatever is applicable to you. Incidentally, these are accurate at the time of this presentation recording, but New Jersey has a habit of changing things, as does everyone, and these links may not work in the future. We can only apologize in advance if that happens to be the case when you're watching this, and at the end we'll provide you with a resource that keeps current. The web address on the screen here is the main one for the New Jersey Department of Agriculture when it comes to the laws of beekeeping. They oversee things in the state. As far as we know, this has been the web address since the laws were posted on the internet, so not much chance it's going to change. If you get to this page, scroll through till you find a large assortment of information about beekeeping in New Jersey, and you will see the statutes listed there. We found a number of websites out on the internet that have links to the state laws across the country and abroad, but this one seems to be the best. They have a vested interest in making sure that they are proactive at keeping the links up to date. Here you'll find links to New Jersey states and territories where you can track your way through to the legislation that applies to you if you happen to be from somewhere other than New Jersey. It seems it would be evident at this point that you have heard from us that you need to do some homework to make sure you're following the regulations as they apply to your situation. If you have a particular question for us, especially about New Jersey, that has not been answered, please ask at our next online meeting. This is one area where we want to make sure you can get all the information required so you don't miss a thing. Up next in the program are lessons on apiary design, hive placement guidance, and as promised, getting bees installed into your boxes. If you have questions, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below, and we'll say thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next lesson.